if everyone is sitting very comfortably, then I will hand over to Richard Graham to begin on how planning applications, how parishes can make an effective contribution.
Thank you, Jim. I'll just press the share screen button and we can get underway. Okay, so as Jim said, my job title is Head of Development Management, and that term, development management, really refers to the service that deals with planning applications, planning appeals, and planning enforcement. And as you'll all know, in national parks, the National Park Authority is the planning authority. It's one of the few statutory functions of the National Park Authority. And as the planning authority, we're responsible for dealing with planning applications and for producing a local plan for the whole area. In fact, we deal with about 700 to 800 applications in a year. And this year looks like being a bumper year. We've had a significant increase that's been building since the end of 2020. One of the things I often get requests from parish councils on is more information on their role in the planning application process, in terms really of how their views are treated and how they can respond in a more meaningful way, really to ensure that what they say carries weight, is listened to, and really influences the outcome of planning applications. So in responding to that request, I thought I would just put out there a couple of criticisms that we regularly get levelled at the planning service. Now, I'd be the first to admit that we're not perfect, nor would I boast that we are somehow better than any other planning authority. But I would say that some of these criticisms, I think, are unfounded or a little bit unfair. I mean, just to give you an example, we do approve about 92 or 94% of applications every year. And that's a figure that is much higher than the average approval rate for all of the planning authorities in the country. And we don't make these statistics up because unfortunately we have to submit them each year to the government and the government checks them. So the criticism that we refuse everything isn't really correct. And as for some of the other criticisms, that we should do what people want us to do, that we're not being consistent, and that we don't put people first, or that we don't even listen. Well, I would have to disagree with that. I mean, I would, wouldn't I? But we do listen to people. We don't always agree with them, but that just isn't the same as not listening. We do ask people for their views, but decisions on planning applications have to be made within the boundaries that are set by the law and by government rules. And to understand this, I think it's worth looking at the planning application process and looking at what factors that we can take into account and how parishes can be better involved in the whole process. So what happens to a planning application? Well, first and foremost, we encourage anyone who is thinking of applying for planning permission to approach us for advice before they do so. People do invest a lot in planning proposals. They're not just applications for development, but they might be an extension needed for a growing family, or a proposal to expand a growing business, or to support a struggling business, or even infrastructure that's going to benefit a whole community. So it's really important that people get good advice right at the beginning before they start spending money on a planning application or an expensive agent or on complicated plans. We can give people advice on whether permission is required, what issues the proposal might raise that need thinking about, and what information they'll need to submit with the plans to enable us and the people we consult, including parishes, to be able to consider the planning application. There's a lot of information about our pre-application advice service and how to access it on our website. But like all our planning authorities, we do have to charge for the service. Nevertheless, for householders, we also have a free service, our planning surgeries, where you can get an appointment with a planner, either face-to-face or by video conference, for free verbal advice. So once a planning application has been submitted to us, the first thing that we do is called validation. And that's a basic process of checking that the application has all the plans and forms that are required by law, plus any other information that we might need, like a flood risk assessment or a BAT survey. Unfortunately, more than 50% of applications are invalid when they're submitted. And the most common issues are that the forms are not completed properly, or the plans, full set of plans aren't submitted. When you put in a planning application, if you contact us, you will find that our planning technicians can be really helpful, and they can explain what's required and can help complete forms and get the thing up and running. When an application is made valid, a clock starts ticking. Planning authorities have 8 weeks to deal with the majority of the applications that they get. This is a government target. The government measures it, and the government can apply sanctions against authorities that don't meet those targets. The other thing is that applicants can also lodge an automatic appeal if an application isn't decided within 8 weeks. So we try to deal with applications within that time frame. But if the application isn't resolved within 8 weeks, we can also agree with the applicant to extend the time frame rather than just say refusing the application. When the application is valid, we publicise it and we consult people. The law requires that we consult certain organisations depending on the proposal. So if the proposal includes an access onto the road, we have to consult the Highway Authority. If it's in the floodplain, we have to consult the Environment Agency. And these bodies are known as statutory consultees that we have to consult by law. But then there are bodies or groups that we consult, not because we have to, but because we want to know what they think, or we basically need their advice on the proposal. And parish councils fall into that category. They're not statutory consultees, but we consult them on all full planning applications. The law also requires that we publicise an application in one of 2 ways, either by a site notice or by writing to the adjoining landowners. And in practice, we do both. We ask the applicant to display the site notice in a publicly accessible place, which is then checked by the planning officer when they visit the site. And we also write to neighbours living within a 20-metre buffer zone of the site boundary. In a rural area, it's not always possible to work out from a map who owns what land, and so we have to rely on the site notice really to fulfil our legal obligation. We also write to the neighbours, as I've said, because we understand that most people like to find out about planning applications that way, but it's also a belt and braces approach if there is a problem with the site notice. So under normal circumstances, planning officers will visit the site. They will check that the site notice has been displayed properly. If it hasn't, they'll put up a new one. And they will be looking at the plans in the context of the site. They'll be checking the plans for accuracy as well. Now, some proposals will need amending because of an issue that's raised by consultees or that the planning officer has found when they visited the site. If the plans need to be changed, then there may be a negotiation with the applicant. Amended plans are then submitted, and then a decision is made about whether to reconsult people on the amended plans. There's no legal requirement to reconsult people, but clearly, if the changes affect people in a different way to the plans that they originally saw, then a planning authority really has an obligation to reconsult them. And we usually allow 14 days for reconsultations. As I hope you'll appreciate that after the initial 21 days consultation, our 8 weeks are starting to be eaten up. So once we've got all of the information that we need and we've made any necessary changes to the plans, we have to assess the proposal. And so at this point, I think we'll look at what factors planning authorities can take into account. This bit, as I think Jim alluded to, is really important to understand, because if a parish responds to our consultation with comments on factors that we can't take into account, then obviously those comments won't influence the outcome of the application. So decisions on planning applications are affected by the law, and the law says that planning decisions should be made on the basis of local and national planning policy and other material considerations or relevant factors, if you will. But the law also gives special weight to local plan policy. So Section 38 of the Planning and Compensation Act essentially says that if a local plan says something about the type of development that's being proposed, then the application should be decided in accordance with what it says, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. Because the law gives this precedence to local plans, it's really important that parishes and residents are involved in framing the policies that go into them. And my colleague Peter will be talking about this after me. In fact, this is one way that the authority listens to people, and the main way as well that we try to ensure that our decisions are consistent, because they need to be made in line with what the local plan says. So we have local plan policies on the one hand. What are the material considerations? What are the factors that can be taken into account in considering a planning application? The Supreme Court has said that to be material, there must be a land use planning matter, they must relate to a planning purpose, they must be fairly and reasonably related to the development in question, and they must not be unreasonable to take into account. So to give you some examples, on the left we have a list of considerations that are material to planning applications, and on the right a list of those that are not. These lists are not exhaustive. Each planning application might have its own particular material considerations depending on what it's for. What tends to surprise many people, I find, is the list of things that can't be taken into account. So that would include the loss of a view or the effect on somebody's property. And these things are not material because they fail the tests, the Supreme Court's tests that I've just referred to. It isn't reasonable to protect a view, because if we did that, nothing would ever get built, because you could see it from your bedroom window if that was a consideration. And the value of a property isn't a material consideration because property values are not established by the planning system. It's not what the law refers to as a planning purpose. So the planning authority is restricted in what it can and cannot take into account. It can't decide things solely on the basis of whether the majority of villagers want it or don't want it. Clearly, some of these material considerations can conflict with each other, and not all of them carry the same weight in making a decision on a planning application. And planners sometimes refer to the planning balance, not in the sense that one consideration cancels out another one, but that some of them have more weight or importance in the decision that's going to be made. So to give an example, a local business might want to expand by erecting a new building, but the building might have a negative impact on the landscape. But would the long-term jobs generated by the proposal would be considered to be more important, despite those negative impacts, and therefore outweigh the negative impacts. As we've seen, the law ensures that the local plan takes precedence, but if it's out of date or silent on a particular subject, planning authorities have to refer to government guidance. You may have heard of the National Planning Policy Framework or the online National Planning Practice Guidance, and I'd urge you to to Google both of those and have a look. They give you a lot of information about the planning system generally, and certainly the planning practice guidance in some detail, the things that we can take into account. For some material considerations, though, the planning authority might have a legal duty that they have to comply with. That's particularly in relation to listed buildings and conservation areas, protected wildlife species and habitats. But there are also duties under the Equality Act and under human rights legislation that we have to take into account as well. So we get down to making a decision. And as I said, the authority receives about 700 planning applications and 100 other applications every year that need a decision making. And clearly it's not possible for the planning committee to consider all of those. So the authority delegates powers to officers to decide the bulk of the applications. Now, all planning authorities do this, and all of them aim for about 90% of applications to be delegated to planning officers, with the committee only considering the major or most contentious planning applications. The parish council's opinion of the application is a really important factor in determining whether the application is considered by the committee or is a delegated decision. Where the parish's recommendation differs from the one that the officers intend to take, then the application is referred to the committee for a decision. However, the parish has to substantiate its recommendation with planning reasons, in other words, with material considerations. And a simple object or we support is not enough. The planning committee has also decided that it does not want the very simple householder proposals, such as house extensions, sheds, and what have you, to be brought to committee. All of the items that do come to committee for a decision, there is a detailed, you'll probably have read them, a detailed report, and each of those reports includes the parish council's comments. They're usually recorded verbatim in the report, but members of the committee also have access to the planning file as background paper and can read longer comments before the meeting starts. The report will also, in the main, include a response from the planning officer to the comments that have been made by the parish, and parishes are sent a copy of the report before the meeting. When we actually get to the meeting, there is an opportunity for objectors and supporters to address the committee. But importantly, the parish council also has a separate opportunity to speak. So parishes influence whether the committee considers the application, their comments are reported in full and responded to, and they have their own slot to speak at the meeting. And there are also usually 2 or 3 of our members who are parish council representatives that sit on the planning committee. All of this, though, doesn't guarantee that the decision is going to go the parish's way, obviously, but the parish view will be heard by the members of the committee. And finally, a decision needs to be made whether to grant permission or refuse permission. A planning application will be subject to conditions, or in some cases, a Section 106 legal agreement, and they will restrict how the development's carried out. Some parish councils include in their comments recommendations for which conditions they think should be applied. And to be honest, that's always welcomed and considered. And a refusal must include reasons explaining why the permission is refused. But both refusals and conditions can be appealed against to the planning inspectorate, and decisions can be challenged in the court. So they do need to be based on local plan policies and sound material considerations that can be defended. I hope this has given you a quick run through the process and helps to answer some of the criticisms I posted at the start. That the authority does listen through the consultation and committee process. But as I said at the start, that doesn't always mean agreeing. Also, that we're bound by law to make decisions for sound planning reasons, even if that decision isn't a popular one. that the authority doesn't refuse everything and actually approves more than most councils do, and that it tries to be consistent by sticking to its local plan policies unless there's a good reason not to. And that's the end. So thank you. If you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat box and I'll try and answer them.
Can I just ask an interim question, if I may, Richard? Section 106 agreements. Can you just give me a little more explanation how that operates? You grant it subject to, then what happens?
Yes, a Section 106 agreement is a legal agreement between the developer, the applicant, and the planning authority. And often when a case goes to the planning committee for a decision and the members decide to approve an application and decide to approve it subject to a legal agreement, the authority's solicitors draw up that legal agreement and basically, after a lot of to and froing, agree a draft with the applicant's solicitor. The legal agreement will usually cover something like local occupancy. So when we grant permission for new housing, we grant permission subject to a restriction that the housing is for local people to occupy, people with a local connection. And it's the Section 106 agreement that ensures that happens. It's a charge on the property that runs with the land, and that's the way that sort of occupancy is enforced. Does that explain it?
Well, does that mean that when permission is given subject to Section 106, that they always go through, or does the Section 106 agreement often scupper the application altogether?
No, it shouldn't scupper the application, because we wouldn't get to the point of taking the case to committee with a recommendation for approval without the applicant's agreement to sign a Section 106 agreement. So it's an agreement between two parties. It can't be imposed on the authority. Can't impose it on the applicant. It has to be, we both have to sign it basically for it to work. Yeah.
So both sides willing.
Both sides have to be willing. Yeah.
Anything come through, Rosie?
Okay, I've got a couple of questions and a couple of comments. I'll start with the questions, but then there are comments which people might want to elaborate on, and we'll have a bit of a discussion perhaps. So I've got one from Ian Macefield of Kettlewell with Starbottom saying, plans often have complex scales and do not show all views for an extension. Could you comment?
Yes, that's right. I talked about the validation part of the process where we check the plans to make sure that they need to meet the national requirements. And the national requirements are basically that the plans have to show, have to describe what's being proposed. And that in practice can be a fairly sort of basic, a fairly low bar. So you do get plans that are pretty poorly drawn, but as long as you can measure from them and that can be transposed onto the ground, then we have to accept them, really. So some plans are works of art and are fantastic, and some are pretty dire. But as long as the dire ones, we can tell what is going to be built, and when the thing is under construction, we can go out with the plans and scale off the plans, how big it's going to be, where it's going to be built, and actually measure that on the ground, then those plans are sound. One of the things that a planning officer will do when they visit the site, take the plans with them, is they will often check the measurements on the plans against what's on the ground as well, to try and ensure that they are accurate.
Thanks, Richard. I've got a question from Rob. Is there any other online access to documents for personal computers, as Citizens Portal does not always show all the documents? So is there another way to access documents attached to a planning application other than through the Citizen Portal?
There isn't a way. The Citizens Portal should show all of the documents submitted with the application. Then there may be some things that are not on there, and they might not be on there for data protection reasons. We have had some problems. I'll hold my hands up. We've had some problems with the Citizens Portal because it's a new computer system which we installed at the end of last year, and there've been a lot of teething problems with it, which we're trying to get to grips with. If there's something that has been submitted or suspect has been submitted and it's not on there, then please get in touch with us and we can email them to you. But everything should be on the portal unless it's confidential, and it would only be confidential for some data protection reason, like it was personal information or financial information or something like that.
Thanks, Richard. I've got a very interesting question from Fran Franklin of Barben Parish Council. Do parish councils have to respond to a planning application in planning speak, or can they say what they think or feel, and do you then decide if it's relevant or not?
Yes, well, you can. No, you please say what you want. Say what you feel about it. Don't think that you have to lapse into planning speak, and I try to encourage certainly my staff to try and avoid it, so if at all possible. It's quite difficult to do that, but what I would say is, yes, say what you feel about it. Two things: try and concentrate on the material considerations, so the things that are relevant to the application, maybe not relevant, not about the applicant or something that just isn't relevant to the development that's being proposed. So try and concentrate on the material considerations. And the other thing I would say is just to be careful about data protection and what you say about people as a corporate body as well. We don't want any lawsuits, please. So, and we don't want to have to sort of redact as well large chunks of parish council comments.
Thanks, Richard. Next question from Richard Jackson at Krakow Parish Council. If a decision stated that a 106 agreement was needed, would the application be declined if the applicant wouldn't sign?
In most cases, yes, because the Section 106 agreement would be required to fulfill some aspect of the authority's local plan policies. So the local plan policy might say, we'll grant permission for housing in these circumstances, providing it's housing for local people, and that is secured through a Section 106 agreement. So if somebody applies for a house, but they said that they're not going to sign that agreement, then that's fundamental to whether they get planning permission or not. So in most cases, I would say that if you decline to enter into a legal agreement with the authority, then it's likely that the application will be refused. There's sometimes room for negotiation if it's not something that's required by the local plan, but those circumstances are fairly rare.
Thanks, Richard. Next question. How much influence does the Yorkshire Dales National Park Design Guide have on applications?
The design guide is a supplementary planning document. So we have the authority has adopted it as guidance. So it is really there as guidance for applicants to help them, produce better designs, to help them think about the context within which the building is going to sit. Often that's about the landscape or the character of the village or the buildings that are next to it. And it tries to give some helpful advice on how to go about designing certain types of development. It's a general indicator of the type of development that we as the planning authority are looking for. We produce it because people ask for that sort of information. It hopefully helps people come up with better proposals and avoid spending lots of money on expensive plans that we then receive and say, look, can you change it because it doesn't quite sit in with the rest of the village or something like that. So it is a material consideration if you look at it in that way.
Thanks, Richard. That leads on nicely to Jane Ritchie's question. She's from Burton-cum-Walden Parish Council and asks, how does an individual get free planning advice?
Yes, well, if you are a resident of the national park and you are wanting to develop your own property, so if you want to build a house extension or do something with your own land, then you can make an appointment for one of our planning surgeries. We hold them pre-COVID. We were holding them regularly in different parts of the national park, but during COVID, we started doing them by video conference, and that's been really popular. So you would give us a ring or email us and speak to the planning assistant for the area that you live in. So if you live in the northern part of the park, so Wensleydale, Swaledale, across to Sedbergh and in the Eden area, the planning assistant for the northern part. If you live in the southern part, this planning assistant for the south, and they can make an appointment for you at one of our planning surgeries. The planning surgeries are not, they're for residents and they are free. They're not for planning agents who we turn away, and they're really not for sort of commercial development. So if you want to build 10 houses, then you should use our pre-application advice service. We also have information on our website as well, so all the local plans are on there. If you have a look at them, have a look at the policies, there's quite a bit of information and guidance with the policies. We also have the design guide up there as well to have a look through too.
Thanks, Richard. Now, I've got a question about conditions from Fran Franklin at Arbon Parish Council. Is there a time limit to get these achieved?
Yes, conditions. A condition will have a trigger. It'll be written in a certain way to say that it has to be something has to be done, or information has to be submitted and approved within a certain timescale. So, if the condition is about the materials that you're going to use in building your extension, and that the materials have to be submitted to the planning authority and approved, basically we have to check that you're using the right materials, then the condition will normally say that information has to be submitted before you start constructing the walls, the above ground construction, and it has to be might have to be approved before the development goes any further. So each condition would have a kind of trigger in there, and they vary from condition to condition.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, our next question is from Patricia Berry, who's from Scothorpe Parish Meeting. Does an application have to state whether it is for private occupation or for rent? And that question also covers Airbnbs.
If we are granting planning permission for open market housing, and the only open market housing that we normally grant planning permission for is on a larger housing site where it is basically the open market housing is subsidising the construction of affordable housing or local occupancy housing. If we give permission for open market housing, then there is no restrictions on who owns it, who occupies it, whether it's their first, second, third, or fifth home, whether it's rented or owner occupied. So if it's open market housing, then there's no restriction. If we're granting planning permission for affordable housing, then it depends. That would usually be in partnership with a housing association, and that might be for affordable rent or for one of the other affordable sort of tenures.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, I have one more question, and then we're probably on to more sort of comments. This is from Simon at Sedbergh Parish Council. Why can't we have more than one email address linked to the portal that sends out notifications of applications? Because if someone's ill or away on holiday, it makes it very difficult to get that information. Is there any way of making that better?
So that's one email address for the parish council. Yeah.
Ooh, I don't know. I don't know if that is generally or just for parish councils.
I assume that's what Simon means. Yeah. I don't know, Simon. That sounds like a technical question. I can take that away and have a look for you. I would kind of probably turn that around to you and say, is there a way of, sharing that email address with, with somebody else in the parish council who could take those comments while you were on holiday? But I'll have a chat with our IT people to see if there's a solution to that, if that's helpful. But I don't know the answer myself, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Richard. I've got a hand up. That's Patricia, so I'll just unmute her. Patricia, do you have a question?
She's muted.
Oh, I'm trying to unmute. Ask to unmute.
Unmute, yep.
Oh, there we go.
When I asked about the Airbnb or private occupation, I wasn't thinking of a complete development. I was thinking of, for example, somebody's bought an old cottage and modernized it.
Right. Well, most old cottages wouldn't be. They wouldn't if the house isn't subject to a legal agreement that restricts its occupancy to local occupancy or affordable housing, then there's no restriction on that. So people can, yes, people can rent them out because they can be sold or it can be used as an Airbnb. There is a debate within the planning profession at the moment over whether there is a difference between Airbnb use and use of a property just as a dwelling, as a family dwelling. At the moment, the general consensus is that there isn't a difference between the two, and so you can do that without needing to apply for planning permission. I think the government is being lobbied on that to try and make a distinction between the two. But at the moment, I think that's the general consensus, and there's been no case law that would really change that view. So,
I have in mind what you said about the material considerations, because I would have thought that a parish meeting or a parish council would not want too many Airbnbs and other organisations that rent out cottages. But if we said that, it wouldn't be material. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think it's a good question. It wouldn't be material because it wouldn't be within our powers. It wouldn't be within our powers as a planning authority to do anything about that at the moment. I mean, I think it's a fair comment to make, and parishes, a lot of parishes, as well as a lot of our members and the authority itself, are concerned about the number of holiday lets there are in villages, and the proportion of them to houses which are permanently occupied. And we will be, it's a hot topic that will be discussed through the kind of local plan process, which Peter's going to come on to in a minute. but as I say, at the moment, there's no, I don't think we have any control over Airbnb unless something changes in terms of case law or the government changes the rules. I think that's the situation. I don't think we can do anything about that.
I would be very happy that if the national park would take that on as a topic, with us being so tourist orientated. It's certainly a very hot topic in our village, where there's a hot tub and a lot of drunken screaming at night.
Yes, thanks, Patricia. Yeah, I sympathise.
Yes, thank you.
Patricia, you're not alone. I've been reading a lot of comments from our consultees in our latest consultation saying just the same sort of things about Airbnbs and the issues that raises. So it's obviously a big issue of concern at the moment. We had a couple of comments in the chat, so I'll read those out, and then if anybody wanted to elaborate or ask questions connected. So Ian Macefield of Kettlewell with Starbottom said, plans can often not be as clear as one would hope. For example, a plan may be for roof windows when an extra bedroom is sought, which also affects parking needs. And we also had a comment from Nigel Phillips from Mask New Forest, which is very pertinent to all parish councils. It's difficult to walk the line between the wishes of an action group within a community and what can be defended by the parish council. That was a very interesting point. So I haven't got any hands waving at me saying they want to follow those up. Oh, Nigel, yep, I will unmute. There we go.
Good evening, and thank you for putting on this webinar. It's very interesting. What I found as chair of the parish council was that, referring to the action group, we were being forced, I felt, in a way, to go in a direction that would be very hard to justify if challenged. And I hadn't realised, and this is sort of general really, that our statutory responsibilities could be challenged legally. And that's what I was very concerned about, that we could end up being challenged by a developer with very deep pockets. If the application was refused, he might be looking for some justification of why it was refused, and we didn't want the ball to be in our court. So that was one thing, and it caused a lot of ill feeling and some resentment within the community, because we wouldn't put forward things that we couldn't actually substantiate and justify legally. The other thing was with the 106 agreement, is there a reluctance to challenge a developer who obviously has non-public money and perhaps more than parks, if it comes down to a legal challenge, if they then deviate from the use of the building that was originally agreed with, e.g. that it was agreed for apartments as a grade listed building, and then those apartments are slightly deviated in another direction for more of a communal wedding venue, larger participation groups. And I could see that is deviating, but would the parks challenge when there is maybe, let's say, 60-40, 50-50 risk that the parks could end up with costs? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll try and answer that. First, the first part of it, I do sympathise with you in being in that difficult position. If you ever in a position like that, where you, whether it's a pressure group or just residents generally, are trying to pressure you to say a certain thing which you think, it either isn't relevant or isn't a material consideration, or you're just concerned that the parish might be liable in some way, then please do feel free to get in touch with us, and we might be able to advise you on that, which would then help you in your discussions with the residents. So, for example, if we came back and said, look, just there is no point in making those comments because we can't take them into account, that might help you in some way with that discussion. But the other thing I would say is that I've never heard in my experience of a developer actually taking a parish council to court because of the things that it said in response to a planning consultation. There might have been some threats made, but I've never heard of that actually coming to court. The other point about if somebody is breaching a Section 106 agreement, then we can. There are various ways that we can enforce the terms of that agreement. We can serve an enforcement notice, or we can seek an injunction from the court, depending on what it is that's happening. The authority has got, in recent years, a track record of taking people to court, so seeing through those sort of enforcement obligations, really, and putting its money where its mouth is. But whether you are a planning authority or a company or just a private individual, if you're considering court action, you have to take legal advice, and the legal advice that you get will advise you on the likelihood of being successful or not. So even though, if your legal advisor says, you've only got a 60-40 chance of winning or a 50-50 chance of winning or whatever, you have to be hard-headed and look at those chances and before you decide whether you proceed to court. So I would say that Nigel, that we have a track record of sticking by what we say in terms of court action, but we would have to be convinced that it's the right thing to do and that we have a good chance of winning it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Rosie. Can we move on to Peter Stockton? If you have any other thoughts or questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and I'm sure we'll have a little bit of time at the end so we can mop up anything from the first half of the seminar, as well as equally questions to Peter on the second half, which of course is the update on the progress of the new local plan. Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Jim, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. I work with Rosie, and we're working on the next local plan for the national park. So we're looking forward basically 20 years at the planning period between 2023 and 2040. So I'll just take you through some of the thinking about the next local plan and sort of explain where we are on certain issues. So hopefully you can see that shared screen. First slide is just showing the area covered by the new local plan in green. The lighter green area is the area, the part of Cumbria, there's also a tiny part of Lancashire as well, that came into the national park and that was designated as a protected landscape back in 2016 now. So we're preparing the new local plan to cover those areas as well as the older part of the Yorkshire Dales National Park as well. The reason we're doing that is, well, partly because it's a legal requirement to do so. We have to have an up-to-date local plan. Partly because the extension of the national park has complicated planning policy, and there are in fact now parts of 10, would you believe, 10 local plans covering those green areas. So we want to kind of rationalize that and just have one sort of simpler go-to strategy with all of our planning policy, all of our local planning policy in it. And the function of that local plan is to set out the long-term development needs of the area. And it's also the place where we will set out policy for the protection of the key assets in that area. So quite a large ranging document covering a very extensive area. and looking forward sort of over the next 20 years. So what are the development challenges over the next 20 years? I don't think these will surprise many people, but we do, of course, have this issue about community sustainability. There are a number of projections looking forward over the next 20 years in terms of what the population might do and where the number of households living inside the national park might be going. And if current trends were to continue, then we potentially facing a situation of depopulation and a reducing number of people living in the park. Now that's not a healthy situation. It has all sorts of implications for the working age population, the ability for local businesses and local services to continue. Clearly, there's an issue in our area in terms of the age of the resident community as well. So we do need to find ways to try and get younger people of working age to maybe move back into the park. Historically, the population of the park, it ebbs and it flows. Up until the last 4 or 5 years, people were moving in at a greater rate than were moving out. So the population was going up, but that trend has changed now. And as I say, the projection, if it continues, is looking at depopulation. Now, COVID's come along. That may have changed that, but we've got to take a sort of 20-year perspective on this. So the local plan is an opportunity to kind of intervene into some of that and look to see what it can do in terms of what we give planning permission for and what our strategies for development are. Clearly, the changes taking place in farming and the need to further diversify the rural economy is a challenge over the next 20 years. And the developments that are associated with that, be it farm buildings or reusing existing buildings for new economic purposes. The shortfall of affordable housing is a critical issue. I'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, climate change, both in terms of reducing emissions and in terms of tackling the implications of climate change on new development. There are other issues as well, but I think they're probably the main ones, the big ones. In terms of the timetable for the plan, we've already started. Back in 2019, we had a consultation on what issues it should address. What we've been looking at over the last year or so are various options, predominantly around housing, but we have also had discussions about what the options might be towards lower carbon development and the type of farm development we might want to see in the national park over the next 20 years. Hopefully by next year, we will have some preferred options that we can consult you on. And then that leads on to a process of submitting to government and then a sort of formal examination we think probably 2023. And we think from about 2023, if the plan's going well, we should start to be able to implement some of the policies and potentially allocated sites in the new plan. So let's have a look at housing, policy for housing. This is almost certainly the most important part of the local plan. It's certainly the part that government considers to be the most important area. We've talked a little bit about community sustainability, and there is a role here for the plan that the plan can try to intervene into this by trying to lead in terms of getting a few more houses built in the park. So we've set ourselves a target, or members have set a target for the plan period of 50 dwellings per annum. Now the intention is that's 50 dwellings completed per annum, which is more than just necessarily granting planning permission for 50 houses a year. And the intention is that is a mechanism that could encourage people to stay in the area, hopefully not lead, because we might have a better range of housing, but also to support people moving into the area to live and work here. We've got some data on the kind of spread of dwellings that we need, and a little bit more than 50% of them are actually houses, and maybe the other 50% is maybe spread between flats and bungalows, i.e. smaller units, for which we have particular demand, because the types of households that require housing in the park these days tend to be smaller households, although we do of course want family households as well. We've already made a decision about the settlement, what we call the settlement hierarchy. So that's the list of towns and villages where we'll allow new housing, and that information is on our website. I think there's about 70 houses in the whole of the new national park area now. And then these other areas of policy, we're either currently considering a response or we're actually out for consultation. So we had a call for sites, and we invited landowners to submit options for sites where new housing could be built on. And we've had about 90 sites received to date. They're not evenly spread across the towns and villages in the national park. There are some settlements, notably in the north of the park, particularly Hawes and Reeth, where we've had almost no sites submitted as well. So we'll need to have a think about that. And it might be that we get a bit more proactive there and directly engage landowners in those areas to see what options are available there. But elsewhere in the park, we've got perhaps a better range of sites to look at. We're also thinking about how we tackle this issue of affordable housing. There is a viability study underway at the moment, and that is looking to see what proportion of affordable housing we might be able to get from new development schemes. If we're expecting the private sector to contribute affordable housing, then that has to be done in a financially viable way. And we need to know whether that's 20% of a site, 30% or 40%, or maybe more. It has to stack up. So we're looking at that at the moment. Members have taken a decision that they would like to see a very small amount of housing in the smaller villages. So these are the settlements that we haven't so far listed in the settlement hierarchy. At the moment, we don't allow new build housing in small settlements, but there is a feeling that there should be some degree of provision in those settlements. We haven't come forward yet with any options of exactly how that might work, but we have that intent in there, so we will be looking at that. And then at the moment, in fact, it's the deadline has just arrived this week. We are out to consultation on the issue of barns and local occupancy. We know those are important issues in the park. We know people have strong opinions about them. So there's no point getting to local plan examination and not having asked people about the options for that, because those issues are going to arise. So we are looking at that. Now, there is quite a big issue there about how important barns are in terms of our overall housing strategy. I think we probably do tend to inflate the importance of barns, and I think it's understandable, because we're not getting enough new housing built in the park. If we were getting more applications in and we were seeing more development for new build housing in the towns and villages, then there would probably be less emphasis on the barns to try and fill that gap, because barns really aren't a very sustainable way of producing affordable housing, or maybe the smaller types of modern housing with modern amenities that are affordable to heat that we probably really need. But anyway, let's have that debate. Let's hear what people say, and we'll take those responses to members in probably December to kind of make some decisions about our direction of travel, both on the issue of barns and the issue of local occupancy, which is seeking to target new housing, or some of the new houses, at people who work in the park or have a social or an economic connection with the area. So we're looking at that at the moment. Obviously, there are other important parts of the local plan that we mustn't neglect as well. But with these issues, we're probably not going to be going out to consult on options for them. I think with housing, there generally are options that we can look at. With some of these issues, the scope for strategic options is much more limited, either because national policy is more limited, or just because we have a lot less going on in the park. So we can probably look at our existing suite of policies, both in the existing local plan for the old national park area, but also the local plans in Eden and South Lakeland, and we can see how we might want to bring those policies up to date and see if there's anything changed in a national perspective, and then come back to you with some preferred directions there. So these are just some of the kind of main topics, really. So employment and business, that's covering extension of existing business, it's covering farm businesses, it's covering development of small new sites for business, it's covering the reuse of existing buildings for business uses. We may also want to develop a new area of policy here whereby we work perhaps a little bit more proactively with the rural estates. So maybe that's some of the big shooting estates, maybe it's people like Sedbergh School who own quite a lot of land, maybe people like the National Trust as well, and just see if there are ways that we can work together and maybe get some of the development, maybe some of the housing, some of the business development that we're going to want to see over the next 20 years. So that might be a new area of policy to develop. Community facilities, we're looking at that. And that covers a wide range of things, from kind of broadband, mobile phone, masts, but also the kind of proposals to change buildings for meeting spaces, and sometimes the proposals to that will lead to the loss of a community facility such as a pub to a new use as well. We need policies around that, and that sort of set out the sort of aspects of when that's going to be acceptable to take that loss, and maybe weigh that against the new uses that are being created. Tourism, clearly a hot issue at the moment because people haven't been going abroad, so we're kind of back to the 1970s position where people are holidaying in the UK, and we're suddenly seeing a lot of people in the park. That's good or bad depending on your viewpoint. It's good to see money being spent, but we do understand that there probably are areas that are at or beyond capacity, and we will look again at our policies for tourism there. They generally up to now have been, we've tried to make those quite supportive, because we do have an objective which we're pursuing that's set out in the management plan to try to raise the quality of tourism in the national park, to get a bit more money spent. We're not necessarily after more visitors per se, but we think there is still scope for more economic benefit and more sustainable tourism in the park. So we'll be looking at that. Then there's the stuff that's set out in national park purposes about conserving habitat, heritage, and landscape as well, to make sure that the development that we're supporting is not going to undermine any of the special qualities that are so essential, essential to the economy of the area, but also essential to its designation as a protected landscape as well. And then the issue of minerals. Essentially, our strategy at the moment is that we're sort of working with the minerals operators effectively to kind of manage the end of life, which most of our quarries are approaching. Most of them being worked since the Second World War or since the 1950s, and they are getting worked out, but there are still some reserves there, and at the moment we are still granting planning permissions to go deeper. Most of those quarries are rail connected, so the material can be taken out sustainably and increasingly by rail rather than road. So we are, we'll look at that strategy again, but at the moment we're probably thinking of rolling that strategy forward into the next local plan. Just the last couple of slides, really. I think it's important to be realistic about what the local plan can actually do. Sometimes we maybe talk it up a little bit too much, because it is a strategy. It doesn't deal with the nitty-gritty. That's the stuff that Rich has just explained. The local plan isn't sort of every case on its merits. It is trying to set out policies and consistent ways of dealing with future development, albeit it needs to be flexible where possible. Just a comment really from working in the Dales for 20 years. Things happen slowly in the Dales, but they do eventually happen. So there are a lot of sites that were around when I first came here, through no merit of mine, but I have watched places like Linton Camp get to planning application and planning permission, Langcliffe Quarry. So stuff does happen, and it's usually pretty good once it has happened. But it just takes a long time. So we just need to bear that in mind when we're looking at the local plan and understanding its ability to engage change. And planning policy, and planning applications really are kind of small cog really in a much bigger delivery machine. The economy, landowner willingness, and entrepreneurship are at least as important as the planning system, as indeed is what's happening just outside the boundary. What's going on in Skipton, Catterick, Kirby Lonsdale, Kirby Stephen, Appleby, even Penrith and Kendal are important to people who live in the park, and are important to the services they provide for people who live here as well. Climate change, clearly a big issue, but just one point to make there, because we don't deal with a lot of development in the park, our ability to really have a big effect on emissions from that development is relatively small. So we're not thinking at the moment of absolutely hammering development to really get the emissions from that right down, because we're going to need to balance that against these other issues such as community sustainability. Where the park can make the biggest difference in terms of climate change is in terms of the land management side. So continuing to manage peat, continuing to manage woodland, continuing to plant more on appropriate sites, working with farmers and transport as well. They're going to have actually a bigger effect on climate change. So that's our thinking anyway at the moment. And then the issue of affordable housing, it's crucial. What I would say here, though, is not to kind of raise your expectations too high, I'm afraid. The range of housing that we see today is really the product of 50 years of national housing policy. And our ability to change that by tweaking planning policy is probably not going to make a big difference in terms of the proportion and sort of numbers of affordable housing. So you're just going to have to bear with us on that, and we're just going to have to continue to kind of work with national policy and lobby that where that's necessary. I'd say the thing that's worked best in the park over the 20 years that I've sort of been observing and involved in some of this and that's the work that the housing associations and the district councils have done in terms of rural exception sites. So these are the sites outside towns and village development boundaries where affordable housing has been permitted. That has worked quite well, and it would be good to see more of that happening, as well as community-led housing, and trying to get as much cross-subsidy from private housing as possible. Right, I'm getting near the end now. So to influence the plan, send in your comments. You know, you're doing that. We're getting comments from you about the barns and the local occupancy. Talk to your members, people like Jim Monday, but also talk to your district councillors as well and your parish representatives. You know, they sit on planning committee, they sit on the park authority, they have influence on policy. Talk to us as officers, please continue to do that. Ring us up if you can, or email us. We will try and engage with you. If all else fails, you do have the option of coming along to the examination. You know, we'd prefer that not to happen. We want the local plan to deliver as much as possible for parish councils, but inevitably it's not going to deliver everything everybody wants. So you do have that legal right to appear at the examination and put your case to the independent inspector. You also have the opportunity of producing a neighbourhood plan, although we've got a few of those in the park, but not many at the moment. Perhaps that's for a different forum, really, but that does exist. It is quite a long process, which might be one of the reasons that a lot of the smaller parish councils in the park have maybe not shown a lot of interest in that process up to now. The last slide is just to show that we are reasonably human. I'm probably less so than my colleagues, and we do cover things other than planning policy. So Andrea, for example, some of you will have dealt with Andrea because she manages the Sustainable Development Fund, which is a pot of money that you can apply for community projects, business projects, commercial projects, as long as those projects are going to be delivering in some sort of aspect of national park purposes, either conservation or enhancement, or promoting public enjoyment and understanding, then there's a pot of money there. We've had a little bit of involvement in FIPL, farming in protected landscapes, which some of you may know about. Andrew's had a bit of involvement in that.